On the afternoon of March 4th, 1933, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood before the Capitol to take the oath of office, the United States was gripped by fear. Banks had collapsed, factories stood silent, and nearly 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. The nation was exhausted, angry, and unsure whether democracy itself could survive the crisis. Then Roosevelt leaned into the microphone and delivered a line that would echo through history. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." In that moment, leadership was not just about policy, it was about restoring belief. And no American president would ever embody that role more fully than Franklin D. Roosevelt. Born on January 30, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York, Franklin Roosevelt entered the world surrounded by privilege. He came from an old, wealthy family with deep roots in American history. His childhood was sheltered, structured, and filled with a sense of confidence that came from knowing he belonged to the nation's elite. Yet this privilege also instilled in him a sense of duty. Public service was not merely an option, it was an expectation. Roosevelt was educated at Groton, a prestigious boarding school, where he absorbed the belief that those with advantages were morally obligated to serve society. He went on to Harvard and later Columbia Law School, though he never completed his law degree. Instead, politics drew him in. Inspired by his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt, he entered public life with ambition and optimism, convinced that government could be a force for progress. His early political career moved quickly. In 1910, he was elected to the New York State Senate, and in 1913, he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The position suited him perfectly. Roosevelt loved naval affairs, organization, and the sense of command. During World War I, he gained valuable experience managing large bureaucracies and navigating political pressure, skills that would later prove essential. Then, in 1921, everything changed. While vacationing at Campobello Island, Roosevelt fell ill with what was then believed to be polio. The disease left him permanently paralyzed from the waist down. For a man defined by physical confidence and boundless energy, the blow was devastating. Many assumed his political career was over, but Roosevelt refused to disappear. The illness transformed him. It forced patience, empathy, and emotional resilience. He learned to listen more closely, to hide pain behind warmth, and to project strength even when physically vulnerable. With the support of his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, he slowly returned to public life, carefully managing his disability in an era deeply uncomfortable with physical weakness. In 1928, Roosevelt was elected governor of New York. Just 1 year later, the stock market crashed, plunging the country into the Great Depression. As governor, Roosevelt experimented with relief programs, public works, and government intervention, ideas that stood in sharp contrast to the federal government's hands-off approach under President Herbert Hoover. By 1932, Americans were desperate for change. Roosevelt ran for president, offering what he called a New Deal, not a detailed blueprint, but a promise of bold, persistent experimentation. He won in a landslide. His first days in office were extraordinary. Facing a collapsing banking system, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, temporarily closing all banks. When they reopened, only those deemed financially sound were allowed to operate. Confidence returned almost immediately. People began depositing money instead of hoarding it. Roosevelt understood something crucial. Leadership in crisis requires communication. Through his famous fireside chats, broadcast over the radio, he spoke directly to Americans in calm, reassuring language. He explained policies simply, acknowledged fears honestly, and made listeners feel included in the national effort. In doing so, he reshaped the relationship between the presidency and the public. The New Deal that followed was vast and unprecedented. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and the Public Works Administration put millions to work building roads, bridges, parks, and schools. Social Security established a safety net for the elderly and unemployed. Financial reforms stabilized markets and regulated banks. These measures did not end the Great Depression overnight, but they prevented total collapse and fundamentally altered the role of the federal government. Critics accused Roosevelt of expanding government power too far. Some called him a socialist, others believed he threatened American capitalism. Roosevelt accepted the criticism. He believed the alternative, mass suffering and instability, was far worse. In 1936, he was re-elected by an overwhelming margin. But his presidency was not without missteps. His attempt to pack the Supreme Court by adding additional justices alarmed even supporters and ultimately failed. And some New Deal programs excluded minorities, reinforcing racial inequalities that Roosevelt was unwilling or unable to confront directly. Then came the greatest test of his leadership, World War II. Initially, Roosevelt worked to keep the United States out of the conflict while supporting Allied nations through economic and military aid. He understood that American public opinion was deeply isolationist, but the world was closing in. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling it a date which will live in infamy. The United States entered the war. Roosevelt became a wartime leader on a global scale. He coordinated closely with Churchill and Stalin and helped shape the Allied strategy that would defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. At home, he oversaw massive industrial mobilization, transforming American factories into the arsenal of democracy. Yet the war years also revealed contradictions in Roosevelt's leadership. The internment of Japanese Americans authorized under his administration remains one of the darkest chapters in U.S. history, driven by fear and prejudice rather than evidence. Despite declining health, Roosevelt ran for a fourth term in 1944. He believed continuity was essential to winning the war and securing peace. By then, his body was failing, but his mind remained focused on the future. He played a central role in planning the United Nations, hoping to create an international system that would prevent another global catastrophe. Franklin D. Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the war. He died on April 12, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. The nation mourned deeply. For 12 years, he had been a constant presence, a voice during hardship, a symbol of endurance. Roosevelt left behind a transformed America. The presidency became a more powerful, more visible institution. The federal government assumed responsibility for economic stability and social welfare. And leadership itself was redefined, not as perfection, but as resilience. Franklin D. Roosevelt was not without flaws, and history continues to debate his decisions. But in a century defined by crisis, he stood at the center of events and shaped their outcome. He reminded Americans that courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to move forward despite it. And in doing so, he became one of the most consequential leaders in modern history.